let's talk about how to grow good soil and why it's hard. And before we get to that, can you just explain a quick level set for everybody? We're talking about soil, and that's not the same thing as like dirt. And there's an important difference there, right?
Right. When I was growing up and I was in our FFA chapter, we had a sign that hung in our FFA room that stuck with me my whole life, and it said it takes 1,000 years to grow 1 inch of topsoil, and then it listed everything that had happened in 1,000 years. It was a lot, and I think people think, soil is just compost. Oh, I'm going to take my apple and some leaves. I made soil. You made compost. You made an organic matter. But soil includes, microbes and living organisms. It includes nutrients and phosphorus and nitrogen, and it includes a lot more than just dirt. There is different layers. Back in FFA, I used to do soil judging. My husband teases me about it, but we used to go out in fields and stand in holes, and we would judge soil, and we would look at the topsoil and then look at the clay and look at the soil as it all comes down. And so dirt is not soil. You cannot make topsoil naturally over a quick period of time. It includes living organisms to get to it. So I, to this day, think about that picture all the time whenever I see houses going in and you watch them just scraping away that topsoil, that then they sell. Developers sell that first 7 inches of topsoil for a high price and then bring dirt back into that land. So.
And I think hearing you say it takes 1,000 years, right? When we aren't good to our soil and we trash our soil through maybe like commercial farming that isn't sustainable, or we put chemicals into our soil, it's not like we're going to have more soil tomorrow, right? We're talking about that's 500, 1,000 years that we're not going to have good soil. And that's kind of scary, right? Like, Charlie, that's kind of scary to think if we're not taking care of our soil, we're not going to have anything to plant stuff in.
Yeah, it's true. I'm not a farmer, but I started out playing on the street. But in South Texas, where it's the Rio Grande Valley, it's all, big ag these days. But when I started hitchhiking around America, I ended up like living on farms, specifically like in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Southern Oregon, and all that. And there's a lot of people there that grow in these very hard environments where it's all about amending the soil. And I wasn't good at really farming, but I had some muscle and I could move dirt. I could move it around, and I know the kind of efforts that would go into making that soil usable. And I just I want it to be good because I love good food, and it's like, I wouldn't necessarily go out there and lick that pavement, because it ain't clean. So,
Yeah, I don't think we want you doing that either. Okay, so good soil is actually also good for the climate. And if you attended the press conference this morning, if you've attended any of the sessions today, you know that the climate crisis is a major topic at Farm Aid this year. And I want to know a little bit more about why good soil is good for the climate. So I'm going to turn to you, Wayne, to tell us a little bit more about that process and how it's helping the climate.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. One of the things I want everyone in the audience and everyone that's hearing to think about is that the soil is its own ecosystem. And if we don't handle it, we love talking about the rainforest. We love talking about temperate forests. We love talking about river basins and riparian areas. We need to address the soil the same way. There are things in the soil that you absolutely need. One of my favorite words to give to people is mycorrhizal. We need to make sure we understand the relationship that the soil has with the roots and that the roots have with the other plants and how they're communicating and exchanging sugars. It's very important. But we think of it as dirt. So it's very important for us to have a healthy climate. If we want to have trees, they're growing in something, right? If you want to get food, they're growing in something. If you don't want inputs, kind of like what we do at our farm, we don't put inputs in the ground. We figure out a way to have less traffic on the pastures, to get more manures on the pastures, more cover crops on the pastures, more mixes on the pastures. And I don't have problems with army worms and other things because we have a home for the birds. We have a home for the wasps. So if we want to talk about climate security, we have to start talking about soil as its own ecosystem. It's the foundation of life. It's the foundation of everything that we do, that we consider dear.
When we're talking about good soil, like the stuff that you're doing on your farm, is that something that could be embraced at other farms? Is that something that really big farms could try to do?
Well, first, let me tell you that this isn't new. This was practiced hundreds of thousands of years before us. We are now having a renaissance back to old practices. So you can do it in your backyard. You can do it on your porch if you live in the city. If you have a terrace garden, you can do it there. The practices, we just need everybody to understand that everybody has a role to play. And if I'm talking to big ag, I would tell them, if you really want to make money, you get off the inputs and get on the soil. That's where your money's going. You're leaching it into the soil. If you want to make money, treat your soil well.
But we're not seeing big ag take this on so much, right? It's really family farmers and small farms that are saying, you know what, we have an important role to play in the climate crisis, and this is one way that we can help that, right?
Well, it's not a job for us. It's a living. It's not a job. We do it because we care, and if we don't do it, we can't make a living. Those guys, they're showing up to their job. So they don't have the relationship that we have with the farm and with the soil. So we can help them if we get in those places. But it's important, again, I say that we must talk about the soil as a living, breathing ecosystem.
What about this? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I think, too, it's so much around education and policy. I am thankful so much for our extension services and our extension, programs in the country. But for a long time, we taught farmers no-till and, leave the land bare in the winter. And we're seeing the effects of soil and of the environment. I mean, it's leaching, and we have runoff of the nitrogens and phosphorus that go into our waterways, that, go into the Gulf, that continue to create these algae blooms. And in the state of Ohio, where I'm from, last year our state spent over $2 billion cleaning up algae blooms in our reservoirs. And so we're seeing these effects in the climate and into our water that come from soil health. And how do we get the upcoming farm bill that's happening that everyone's talking about, and all these upcoming programs, how do we get soil included when it comes to cover crops? We support big ag in crop insurance programs. We support them in many of these various write-off programs. But how do we get it so we're supporting them in cover crop programs? And how do we get it where we're supporting them in soil health and soil growth programs, so that way that it does incentivize them to move forward into thinking about the soil as a part of the system? I mean, at this point, and I think we're at a critical moment where we really can do that because of the current climate and what's happening over in Ukraine and Russia with the inputs and the chemical inputs. The costs are 4 times what they were 2 years ago or something. And so we're at a moment where farmers will listen, because they are for the first time realizing, I can't pay that level for these inputs. What else can I do? And can we say, well, have you ever heard of winter wheat? Have you ever heard of winter rye? Like, it's time to talk about maybe some of these cover crops that then can be put back into the soil and help build the soil more naturally.
One of the things that I've been trying to do all day today, because it's a crisis, right? But I think it's important that we focus on opportunities of hope. It's important that we focus on the things that are working. And so for the soil is inputs, that's your term for things that are going into the soil, right? So when we think about soil that has had a lot of inputs, right, that has had a lot of chemicals, is that it? Is that like a nuclear wasteland? Is there anything that we can do to fix that?
Cover crops. I mean, that's the best start. And in our community, I live next to this area called Buckeye Lake. It's a huge water reserve. I sit on one of the largest aquifers in the country. And right now, they're doing a pilot program with cover crops, and they're paying farmers to put them in. And you go down the highway now, and there's signs everywhere that says these cover crops are sponsored by, whoever. And they also are beautiful, and people love them, and it's starting a conversation. And last year, they had more farmers sign up for the cover crop program than they had money for. And I think that's positive.
Awesome.
Yeah, we can clap, yeah.
And can I add again, if we're thinking about the soil as a body, when all of us go to work, we have long days, we're stressed, all those inputs are stressing the land. Sometimes you just need to rest it. Mm-hmm. Let it rest. Mother Nature has never made a mistake. Let her rest. Don't put a cow on it. Don't put sheep on it. Don't put inputs on it. Let what grows, grows. Let what die return back to the earth. And we call it part of the manures. Well, the sister was talking about NPK. Well, this is green manure. And everything that's alive returns to the earth. And we're going to have to start believing some of the stuff we say. If we say ashes to ashes, dust to dust, at some point we're going to have to believe it and practice it with our soil. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to eat.
Not to dive into that a little bit more, but I think that I think Micah earlier was like, well, if you like eating, then you should care about what we're talking about here. And it sounds like this is kind of the same thing. Like, what happens if we don't start using sustainable practices with our soil? Are we going to run out of soil to plant stuff in?
We're going to run out of food. We have to bring it to that. We don't need to talk about soil all the time. We need to bring it to this from a social science standpoint, right? We need to talk about it in a way people can understand it. You won't have food. You have seen places where we talked about it twice today, where people said they put tomatoes out, but the tomatoes did not grow because they were in stressed ground. You got to let it rest. You don't have to put a chemical in everything. And think about your body. Sometimes you have to come off of the meds to heal. And it's just resting in water. And then you can come back to life a little bit and then make some better decisions.
I have been there. So, Charley, it sounds like you've had kind of firsthand experience working with soil, right? Working with dirt. How do you think folks like me, other consumers, how do you think we could learn more about this or find the importance of it? Should we also literally put our hands in soil too?
Well, I mean, it's all circumstances with how you end up interacting, you know, with farming, gardening, and those things. I mean, people at their homes, the simplest ways that I know that ordinary people can get acquainted with it is, you know, simple things like he's talking about terrace gardening or like small, you know, kitchen gardens, like where your herbs are the thing, like garden herbs are some of the things that most people are familiar with at a basic level that aren't really farming, or how easy it is to maybe like get in with like raising chickens that can eat, you know, if you're to eating the eggs and stuff. That's something that even in, you know, urban areas like where I'm from in Texas, most of those are still in residential areas are still zoned ag. And you see a lot of the older generation or a lot of in communities, people of color, where you see a lot more folks still raising animals like in a neighborhood, you know, and acquainting more of the young generation, you know, with that kind of lifestyle. That's because it's not something that I think people are just going to automatically jump into. And I just want to bridge over to this real quick. It's like you have to remember that so much of what we're talking about here is corporations and the impact that they have on what we're eating. You know, most of what we're eating, if we're being honest here, it's not coming from family farms. It's coming from corporations, and corporations exist on a current philosophy of externalizing cost, you know, or externalizing cost, short-term gains, and you've got people that are far removed from the environment that they are having to serve these people's, you know, profit, you know, goals. So I don't have the answers. These guys are a lot more educated than me when it comes to this type of situation, but it's like the principles and ideas of those people running those companies, they're the ones that have to pick up these ideas. And I would equate it to like music culture, all right? So in New Orleans, where I played on the street a lot, places like Memphis, Tennessee, these are poor cities that culturally have needed to stand by the pride of their musical history, right? The cultural history in those towns as a means for bringing commerce, generating commerce in those towns. Whereas like Dallas, for example, that has a very rich heritage like that, it's a much bigger city with a lot of money pouring into it. So they have deprived its musical heritage or denied it, or, you know, there's an amnesia to it. My belief is that if a big city like that puts its cultural heritage up front, that is good for business and it's good for the future of the young generation. And I think you have to apply that same idea to, you know, farming, to soil practices, to like kids got to see this stuff. Kids got to have some way to see this, you know, from a young age. And maybe those people become the ones running those corporations, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, well, and we have two folks who are from generations of farmers, and I saw you shaking your head going, yes, yes. So what's your reaction to that? Why is that so important?
Well, we have to model the way, right? So if we want the children to understand it, we have to take them to the farm. And when we do tours, and it sounds a bit morose, but if there's a dead squirrel and a little boy comes and wants to stick the squirrel with a stick or poke it with something, I tell the mama to leave him alone. You might be interrupting the doctor. If they want to dig in the dirt and see what's under the dirt or dig under a manure patty to see the worms, I said, leave them alone. You might be interrupting the soil scientist. So we have to give these kids and people, all of us, opportunity to get onto farms, and so that we can stop thinking that a farm is a grandmom, grandpop, couple of chickens, a cow in the background, and the sun. You know how we all drew that in kids? And we need people to think about whatever your thought is for a farm, whether it's a terrace farm, whether it's a hydroponic farm, whether there's a gentleman I just got in touch with, he raises reptiles. So he's growing his own collard greens and things to feed his mice. But he's employing 10 or 11 people in a local economy. And we have to be open for the difference in what agriculture can be. And agritourism, like the brother was saying, it's important for us to show people. You have to see what's going on. You have to see what happens at a cow farmer. If you're going to buy a cow from us, I expect that at some point you make a trip to see that there's not a bunch of needles on the ground. Yeah. Make a trip to see that, well, wait a minute, you don't have enough grass. So if you don't have grass, and how are you a grass-fed operation? So we have to educate our consumers so they can ask those questions.
And that's actually something Bryn has been doing all day in the skills tent. And so from your perspective, working with a lot of consumers, are you optimistic that we're open to learning about soil and open to learning about these more sustainable practices and taking it a step further and actually demanding it from the food systems that are currently in place?
I do. I think, so all day I taught gardening classes in small spaces over in the skill tent. And it's always weird for me to say I grow produce on 100 acres, but in my spare time I teach people to garden in small spaces. But I think it's so important for people to get their hands dirty, for their mental health to touch dirt. And I think, how are people ever going to connect and understand the importance of our farming if they don't understand how hard it is themselves? And I think that every day I see more optimism and more hope. This year, during the pandemic, I thought for sure, I really worried about our farm. I worried about the farm markets. I thought nobody was going to come out. And that's when we saw just it take off. I mean, we had our best sales ever during those years. And I think people during that time really returned back and really looked inward at slowing down and where does their food come from? How do they nourish their bodies? How do they nourish their communities? And that gave me so much hope. And watching people finding new ways to buy local produce every day, watching the restaurants kind of come out of the pandemic and restaurant sales are picking back up. But it does take consumers. You need to ask, like, your local restaurants, why are you not buying local produce? We have chefs all the time that say our consumers don't care. So that's where you participate. You have to demand that a little bit.
As a farmer, with what happened with COVID, there was a point in my business that I wanted to be the biggest producer. And then I realized that there has to be a me the next county over, and then the next county over, because we're the guys that write the check to the Little League. And if I'm only in my community, I'm only concerned with my community, there's a revenue stream that's missing somewhere else. So my wife and I, we had to revamp our whole business model, get rid of all kinds of inputs and get rid of the idea that I have to be bigger to be better. Yep. And once we decided to be better, not bigger, I now have another revenue stream of consulting small mom and pop farms to get started. And now I'm telling them, nope, you don't need 100 acres. If you have a side job, you can take these 20 acres. Let me show you how to rest it, how to manure it, how to cover crop it, and how to keep you from having to go into debt like we did trying to farm. So that's how you save soil, is if people can make a living, however they make a living, and get a bill paid off of their farm. The aim is not for you to pay your life and get rich. because then you're going to go the way of the corporate farmer. But if you can buy Johnny a first baseman mitt and maybe go to Myrtle Beach or somewhere once or twice a year, that's what family farming is. And you may have another job somewhere, but that's how we save soil, by not making people so desperate that they have to take any means necessary to get a profit off of this farm.
How do you start that conversation? How do you start that conversation with a farmer? How do you come in and say, look, I know what's going on here, but your soil is not good, and we need to work on this? Like, is it just that straightforward as saying we need to work on this? Both of you made a face, so I'm thinking it's not that
hard.
straightforward.
I mean, it's becoming a little bit. I know we want to stay hopeful, but it's hard because it's become generational, and so a lot of the guys I work, and I think this year with inputs and the cost of inputs because of what's happening in the world, farmers are very much all of a sudden looking like, how am I going to pay for that nitrogen next year? And when you start to have that conversation of there's other ways and rest your land, and it becomes overwhelming, I think, to take something that people have done generationally, that their dads did, their grandpas did, and ask them to switch back. And I think that's where, again, we need to work with our county extensions, and we need to work on plans as a society and saying, we want to support these guys. We want to support them in re-educating and relearning how to do it without inputs. My family, when we moved to Ohio, my dad did expect us to be corn and soybean farmers. Like, that's what he thought we would do. And it was within 2 years when it felt like we were told, like, this is the seed, and this is when you plant, and this is when you spray it, and then this is when you harvest it, and then you throw the rest of the seeds away. And that's when my dad was like, this is not farming. I'm not doing this. And we went into produce. But how do you talk to the guy who he's been doing it for 50 years? And I think that we're at a moment where we really can have that conversation because so many of these chemical inputs are so expensive that I think we're at a really key moment. I hope that we really take it and run with it.
It's an exciting time, and I use the story of the brown egg. So 10 years ago, nobody had brown eggs. Nobody wanted brown eggs. You went in the grocery store, you couldn't find brown eggs. And with us, if you have a farm or you have a couple chickens, we're all egg snobs, right? So we just want our yard bird eggs. So the other day I went in the grocery store, and there was a unsorted dozen brown eggs in the grocery store. So the message is out there. So when I'm talking to other farmers, I'm like, hey, man, do you remember 10 years ago when you couldn't find a brown egg and people laughed at us for having a brown egg and then a green egg? And now at the grocery store, they don't even have extra large anymore. It's just farm raised, cage free, pasture free. And I love it when they say vegetarian chickens. I was like, well, you never met a chicken. They're little velociraptors. So you have to tell those stories. And we have to let people know that the change is coming, but it begins with you. And when I started getting phone calls, they may not have used the word correctly, but they wanted to know, are your cows on a nutrient-dense pasture? And I was like, okay, the words are starting to get out there. People are asking questions. That's how we make the change. And you have to lead with that. And the other thing I lead with is I have fallen completely on my face in this business. I married well. I married somebody good with numbers who was able to say, hey, my man, this ain't working. And we're going to need to zig where you zagged. So when you lead with your failure, then farmers understand that you understand it. And I tell a story that there was a period in time in my agricultural life, I had to ask my wife for $20 for gas. Now, this was the meeting that set me on the correct path. But had my wife not given me the grace to hurry up and give me the $20 so I can get to the car because I thought I was going to cry anyway, to give me the grace to just give me the $20 so I can go get the gas so I can go get moving, I would not be able to tell that failure story and how we reclaimed the farm, the situation, what we were doing to get good. So I lead with my failures when I talk to farmers.
in some ways, it feels a little bit like a win-win because you're doing something that's better for your farm, right? You're doing something that's sustainable, that you're not buying expensive inputs anymore. And ultimately, it's better for the environment, right? And both of you, while you were talking, Charley, I noticed you were smiling, especially when Wayne was talking. So hearing these experts say, we're at an inflection point, but they're both, it seems, optimistic. Does that make you optimistic?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Like, yeah, I was thinking about that. Just a lot of the, it has a lot to do with what the public demands. You know, it really does. You know, and what is popular in the eyes of, you know, common Americans. So and you know, we are what we see. So, you know, that's why I believe that, you know, from the gifted, much is expected, you know, when it comes to people farming, but also when it comes to the people that the public are modeling themselves off of as movie stars, professional athletes, musicians. You know, the things we talk about and the things that we champion and that we stand up for, that can reflect back in the people looking at us, you know, and it's like that, you know. It's like you get the leaders that you ask for in a way, you know. So if you're not paying attention, you know, shady people pop up, you know.
We don't want that.
We call that agro-greed. You know, you got agritourism. Now there's a whole category called agro-greed. Everybody's trying to get paid now.
So we're almost out of time. I want to end on something that we as consumers can do, because I think there are a lot of consumers who come to Farm Aid along with a lot of farmers, right? So I'll start with you, Wayne. What is one thing that you want a consumer in this audience to take away from today's discussion? Like, what's the most important thing they should keep in mind about soil, or what's the most important action they should take?
Buy local.
Period.
Your friend is going to take care of you. It's that simple.
All right, Bryn?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think, you know, we know that Americans eat almost 70% of their calories outside of their home. And so as a farmer who grows produce, you know, I can't think that you're going to buy all your vegetables from the farm market because you don't cook that much. So find ways to ask your favorite local restaurants and asking your wholesale buyers. I mean, we sell to universities, we sell to hospitals, we work with a lot of accounts, and it just takes that type of consumer demand and consumers asking to get our food into all the places that you're buying your calories.
All right, Charley, last word.
Like my man here, I would say you are what you eat. That's what I meant by you wouldn't go out there and lick that pavement, you know. But people eat all kinds of things all the time and don't even know what's in it. I had to have 2 heart surgeries 3 years ago for genetic stuff, and then when they're putting you through that therapy, and you know, I was kind of scheduled to die, and I just got lucky. You know, they teach you about this Mediterranean diet is what they talk about when you're going through cardiotherapy. Now, that's something I would have never known about, you know, and I'm not educated and come from an affluent background. But, you know, on the other side of that heart surgery, you know, I'm looking back at it, and it's like, well, you know, I want to be here as long as possible, you know, and I feel like the Creator gave me a second chance. So, you know, you are what you eat.
Great. All right, everyone. Round of applause for our 3 incredible speakers today.